club, more or less, and we had the 9th Street show is because there was no interest in our kind of work. The 9th Street show was the first show which the artists put together. And it was only prior to it, the Armory show, much earlier.
Right.
And I think it has this importance as, in my view, as the Armory show had at that time. Because the curators and the gallery people, they didn't care for what we were doing. Is that correct?
Yeah,
correct?
Sure.
The interesting aspect about it was the haphazard way in which it was put together.
Right, everybody describes the elephant, you know, from a different point of view. I was with Franz, since I lived in the building,
yes.
You know, and I saw Franz every day.
Yes.
And the two of us had both, we were going to find out about a gallery, about a place to make a gallery. And it was right on the same street, right near us.
Yes.
We were too lazy to look further than that.
Yes.
And we said, okay, maybe let's do it here. And the rent there, I think, was $50 a month. How long did that show last, the 9th Street show? Oh, May 23rd?
May 21st
to June 10th. 20 days, roughly.
Conrad, I am curious, but did anybody review it?
Yeah, I think it was reviewed by the Art News.
Oh, yeah, I
think Tom Hess reviewed it.
Yeah. The other thing was anything sold?
Stuart Preston reviewed it.
Nothing
I
sold.
don't think so.
Well, if it had sold, it would have been a commercial show.
No.
You don't want it to be a commercial show.
Weren't they up for sale? My painting
they
was
were up for sale, but nobody expected to sell anything.
Oh, of course.
That was the difference between then and now. There was a purity in the air. No sell.
Right.
In fact, I remember when some artist once said he sold a painting, maybe to Leo Castelli, for $50. And then he came in a week later and he said, you know, I sold another painting. We all looked at him and we said, boy, is he getting commercial? 2 in 1 month? Oh.
As a matter of fact, I remember if you did anything but paint, I remember John Ferrin was very reluctant to even mention that he taught at Queens College.
Yeah.
I mean, it was like something.
A little corruption.
Yeah.
For earning money outside of painting. But actually, everybody was living really pretty down low.
Yeah.
There was no money around.
Very much.
And they must have done something to get some money up.
Surreptitiously.
So, I mean, they had a relative, they had somebody gave them a couple of bucks, somehow something had to happen.
Well, it was around that time that almost no artists were teaching in universities.
Yeah.
That is modern, with modern ideas. But then it started very slowly, and a certain respectability crept in until finally most of them ended up teaching one way or another.
Was there a sense of corruption when the 9th Street show was taken over by the Stable Gallery?
No.
Was there kind of a...
Not then, no. Because actually the Stable Gallery, because the Stable Gallery did the show, it made it easier for the thing to continue. Because if it hadn't been for a gallery uptown New York, with the proper space, making catalogs, and having a staff to look after it, so it stayed for a month, it didn't have to have us go there and clean up the place and look at it and finance it. It went on. And every year it got better because more people joined the show, and the show got bigger and it was more representative. But there was still no money in it. The show I had there was with the Stable, and I think it must have been 1953.
53 already,
Because when she opened the gallery, she didn't have any knowledge at all about painting. And we got to know her. It was a beautiful space. And we talked about what she could do about having the show, the 9th Street show, transferred there. So since she had the money, she could do it without charging us anything. And that's how we started that first show. And after that, we tried to make the gallery work. In fact, Nick Carone went there, and he worked for a whole year as an advisor to it.
It was a very unique gallery. It had a chronic odor of horse manure. So.
Which was a beauty.
There was only one thing.
Just remember, it was always, you smelled that. It was a wonderful odor. You went up that ramp.
I didn't think it was so wonderful all the time. I can remember a couple of hot days going up there, and I couldn't even stand it. I had to leave. Very much about this period is, what was the art that really was done at that time that was, highly creative? We know abstract expressionism was one of them, but I'm not even sure what abstract expressionism is, because certainly Barney Newman wasn't abstract expressionist and so on, you know, Rothko,
Yeah,
Still.
right. It's just the name, yeah.
When you look back at it, if you forget the labels,
Right.
there was a hell of a diversity there
Of
of
course.
artists of all types
It's a very good
who
point.
do not fit right into the category of abstract expressionism.
Who made
There were
that
also
vote?
people who were doing some surrealism at the time.
Wait just a moment.
Pop art was starting and so on. And it's interesting to, I was wondering if like we could talk about this and see if we can define a little bit what the hell came out of it.
Well, and I think that there is a tendency to think of abstract expressionism as that form which seems to have become more popular, which had to do with painting with brush marks and drips and drops and all that.
And Greenberg changed it to New York School
Now,
for a
well,
good
I mean,
reason.
that seems to be the tendency of abstract expressionism as an idea. But if you analyze the word abstract expressionism, Rothko and what's his name, Clement Newman and all that, they could fit in it from the fact that they're abstract and they're expressing.
No, but they weren't expressionists. The idea of expressionists
Means the
became
agitation.
part of it. Yeah,
That's
more
what I say.
emotional and so
But
on.
I mean, the term has taken over
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
technique of the expressionistic technique as being just abstract and expression.
Yeah.
It was not
Well,
figurative.
doesn't
And it
action
was-
painting
Action
make it a
painting
little more
again.
specific?
Yes, action painting
as,
would
as
be
the more
more
drippy, the more...
But you know, all
Gestural-
those
gestural.
terms, even Rosenberg talking about that he created action painting with I remember the time he did it, when he wrote the first article, which was about Pollock's painting, and he called it action painting. And Pollock was furious when he read it the next day. He says, we were talking all night last night, this guy doesn't understand anything. I was talking about the act of painting, and he converted it into action painting. And action painting, of course, clicked immediately. Of course, in Europe, they thought action painting had to do with cowboys.
Did you think Clement
Only.
Greenberg was more knowledgeable?
Well,
He
Clement
had more
Greenberg
sense, I
is,
think.
he's knowledgeable, but he's very perverse.
Yeah.
Anyway, he's a dictator
Yeah,
with
and
his
how?
ideas.
Awful, awful.
And I hate to say this, sometimes he's right. Sometimes he's right.
But sometimes
which
he's,
is
and often he's very wrong.
It's very difficult because he's been wrong so many times, and then every once in a while, he was right really with France.
Well,
When he picked out that black and white doodle, that was the best thing
Yeah.
France
a
did.
lot of people felt a hunger for somebody to come along and say, 1, 2, 3, this is
You
art
want to
and
say
this
something?
isn't.
Yeah.
Right. You cannot talk about art except it's poetic. Otherwise you cannot,
But
with words.
if you say that and you really mean it, that means that very few people can relate to art because they don't have the background or the interest to deal with
No, they might
poetry
not be
in
able
that
to
sense.
express it in words. They still may have a very direct feeling.
Well, the poetic
Yeah, but
equivalent
you're
is
talking
really
about
the
equivalence.
closest thing you can get to the meaning of a
Right.
painting. Almost to a man, and woman, the abstract expressionists disliked pop art, and then the succeeding movements that have come along. At least so it seems to me. Am I right in that?
So, the so-called
That
pop
is
art
shit.
is really what we're talking about then is commercial art.
No, I would not
I mean,
equate that at all.
well, take some of the painters that are well known of that period, of the commercial artists, that became well known with the Leo Castelli.
Well, it is.
Did you see the show, High, Low, at the
Yes.
Museum of Modern Art?
No, I
Now,
didn't.
that show, in my opinion, was a very, very clear show of what pop art in America is in relationship to the art movements. They showed so many fine pieces of art, mostly European, from Leger to Picasso to everyone else, and they were taken from commercial art, like there was a Leger ad,
see it.
a commercial ad, and Leger
I
made a
didn't
painting
once
of it.
see it.
I also
But Leger made a painting using, would say, the concept of commercial products. But he made it art again. He made it a Leger painting. Now, in every one of these artists, there was that kind of transition. Even in the Dada movement, even in the anti-art movement, there was always this feeling that it was an artistic thing. When you move into the museum and they come into the large, huge painting of Liechtenstein, Rosenquist, I think it was. Anyway, big ones. You see where this has been taken from the commercial world and
That's
put into
true.
a museum.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but that's-
As objet trouvé, just put into a museum.
Entirely.
Now, there is no transition that these men were commercial artists. It isn't an artist that's looking at commercial art and being inspired. These are commercial artists doing commercial work, being very happy in their commercial world. The Museum of Modern Art takes them and says, you're not commercial artists, you're great artists. and then puts them in the museum.
Yeah, well, that's a view, see, that you have, which I wouldn't agree with.
Well, you don't have to agree with it. It's true. It's true and it's right. So we don't need any more agreement.
Because in general, we look back to it as such a marvelous period of our youth
But
when we were young.
you think that the pop artists didn't get enough attention? I mean, are you sorry for them?
So let's say the love of painting.
Right. That's
The
what-
love of painting, which really I felt, being a young pup, hanging around the Cedar Bar and listening to these guys, there was a sheer love of painting, which I think never existed before.
And not tainted by commercialism. not
Right,
tainted
and the
by
joy
marketing.
of painting, and the camaraderie, and the discussions we had about, and the fights we had about painting, and listening to these guys, I thought it was wonderful.
A lot of that
and
is
that's
because
what,
we were young, though.
Not only.
We look back at
No.
our youth and the kind
But
of...
the same thing was not going on in Europe. And they were
Right.
young. They were young too.
That's true,
No,
but
because the-
also the being young, though, is a part
No,
of it.
but the point is that I think in America, especially, that quality that was born and lived for a very short period, 4 or 5 years of that period, where it was not touched by commercial gain, by publicity, by fame, and we must consider that the artist in America was a reject of society. He
Right,
was not accepted
right,
in society.
yes, right.
In Europe, the artist is accepted.
Not always.
No, most of it.
Well,
Most of
Sarah
France,
Van Gogh, he
Spain,
was not
Italy,
accepted.
they're all accepted. You can be an artist in a European setup, and you
Nowadays.
can make a drawing for a book jacket, you can do a drawing for a poster of a movie, and not make it commercial. You can do your drawing, like it fits in. You do it in your style. I've seen posters in France and Italy that are works of art. They're beautiful. Commercial things, book illustrated. So they could live.
Wonderful things in Japan.
You know,
Posters.
Absolutely.
Poster art.
but Conrad,
Wait a minute.
yeah, go ahead.
In other words, there, the artist could be easier to corrupt because he was given a hand into society, he could paint pictures, and he could even maybe sell them, and he could even earn a living out of it. In America, there was no hope. So that period, the artist was going for broke. He had no hope of making money. There was no hope of doing anything. So he said, then I'm going to be free. I'm going to really paint what I love. Let's see what it is. And that's why the abstract expressionist movement could find a route here, because there was no hope anyway. Whether he painted a sailboat or whether he painted a landscape, he wouldn't have sold it.
There really was something new coming into art at that
The
time.
words of Frank Lloyd, when he said at the trial
The guy from Marlborough.
for Marlborough, he said words that remain in history. Art is what sells. So from then on, you've got what is happening. Art is what sells. So pop artists have promotion, and they know the way of doing it, and they've gotten it.
And most people like it.
What can you say? We were there, and 9th Street was there, and then we did the show. And hopefully, we thought we were going to have a nice show, and it turned out all right.